Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cloud Wars Live, where we explore today's digital revolution by speaking with business executives and thought leaders who are changing how the world lives, works, plays, learns, and dreams. Our guest today is Sean Ammirati, who's got a fascinating dual career as both a venture capitalist and a professor of entrepreneurship at Carnegie Mellon University. Sean himself is a serial entrepreneur. He's an author and also a podcaster. He's one of our regular monthly digital all-stars. And Sean, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
So, Sean, a couple things. One is, there's the whole world of WeWork. What
Yes.
the heck is going on there? And Sean, what are your observations?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot, I think, that we're in the process of unpacking when we think about WeWork. And, I think there's a lot of lessons along a lot of different levels here. If you've been living under a rock and haven't heard what happened, right? So WeWork, which was certainly a rocket ship in terms of their ability to consume cash, if nothing else, over the last few years, was all set to go out at a roughly $50 billion market cap. And in the process of issuing their S1 and starting that road show, I think as people spent more and more time looking at the business and the company was forced to take some maybe questionable metrics that they came up with this concept of what they called community-driven EBITDA, which Bob, I know your brother's an accounting professor at University of Pittsburgh. I'm fairly confident Harry's never taught community-driven EBITDA to anybody before. I think we just call that a made-up metric. I think that would be actually the way to describe that. But as the market started looking at these things, the IPO basically went off the tracks, or at least is going to be significantly stalled at this point. And then as more and more information came out, the company and the founder and CEO ultimately decided it was time to bring in some new leadership to the organization, which is kind of an amazing pivot, because if you actually look not that many weeks ago even to the original S1, the CEO was elevated to Jeff Bezos level in terms of the number of mentions in the report and just this critical asset, and the board had given him all kinds of control. So he got 10 votes for every one vote of his shares, so basically give him effectively control over the board. So a lot's come out, and I think there's rightly a lot of criticism, both in some of the cultural things that have come out about stories about how he led the organization. If those rumors are true, I think people need to be held to a higher standard on that front. And also there's a lot that's come out around how the board managed the entity, which is also real. Like corporate governance is something that's important, and it doesn't seem like maybe was taken that seriously. To me, though, beyond all that sizzle and sort of fodder for great popular press articles, to me, I think there are some lessons here that are worth stepping back as we think about digital transformation, right? The topic that you're focused on here and this digital revolution. And to me, lesson number one, and I think it's important not to miss this, is when you're talking about moving physical things like atoms, like in this case real estate, the costs around that are just different. And one of the things I think that feels from the outside looking in may have happened here is I think SoftBank, who's the largest funder of WeWork and has basically propped up a lot of these late stage companies, tried to treat it like a completely digital company. And I think that's why you see metrics like quote unquote community driven EBITDA, even though it never would have the unit economics that would come along with a digital business, right? This was always at the end of the day a real estate business. And the way real estate businesses work are that you have to actually either buy or lock into long-term leases, fixed assets, and those come along with real costs. And it looks like as you sort of unpack the S1 and they've been pushed to create more normal metrics, we still don't have a sense on profitability of individual properties there. So it's still a little bit difficult to slice and peel that back, but it's clear just from what you can decipher from the financial statements that the unit economics were never going to look like unit economics of a business like EC2 or S3 or the Google Cloud or the Oracle Cloud, right? This is not that kind of business. This is actually is more of a lock-in fixed assets and then slice them up for tiny premiums. And there's a different multiple applied to that, and you got to run those businesses differently. That doesn't mean that it's not important for innovation to come to commercial real estate. I think that's incredibly important, but we need to do it in a way that takes into account the realities of corporate real estate and really any of these industries that are being transformed now.
Hey, Sean, it's a fascinating story. And in some ways, it's easy to look back and say, what were those morons thinking?
Yes.
2020 hindsight and so on. But there's just, it speaks to this notion of this sort of phenomenon here that, everything new, everything different is sort of cool, interesting, and all this. And your point, I think, that really strikes home to me, that the first thing you said was, when you deal back in the physical world, the world of atoms and stuff and real estate, speaking to that so clearly, fixed assets and so on like that, you can sort of dress that up all you want with the fancy terms and the slick marketing and so on, but ultimately, those things have a level of cost to them that just can't be swept under the rug or played with. So I was laughing about your community-driven EBITDA. And I guess that's one of the warning signs, right? When people start, even if today's financial metrics aren't all perfect, when people start to come in with these sort of new age metrics, it's got to make somebody like you a little bit nervous as you look at these things.
Yeah. And I think so I think that's exactly right. And I think you're right that like it's easy with 2020 hindsight, right? But the point is, there's a difference between, so all of the SaaS companies today that you cover so well, right? They report GAAP accounting that looks like what your brother teaches young MBAs every day, right? And then they also give additional metrics that are relevant to help you understand what's going on in a subscription economy. I have no issue if WeWork wants to say, look, here's our general accounting statements, these are GAAP just like everything else, and here's some things that will help you understand how those statements evolve over time, right? So in the SaaS world that so many of your listeners are used to, right, it is really relevant to understand things like lifetime value. Churn's really important. What's the real cost of acquiring those customers, right? Those are important metrics to understand if you're thinking about many of these cloud businesses, but you can't do those and then ignore the fact that ultimately things like cash flow and unit economics and, frankly, profit and loss, like real EBITDA, what's the real earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. It's like a real thing. You still got to actually give people that information, right? And you got to make sure that the metrics that you're using to help, provide insights into how the business are run actually tie back to ultimately the way that all businesses ultimately are judged, right? Which is their ability to make a profit at some point in the future.
Sean, I'm going to bring in another subject here that ties to this. And again, I'm getting the 2020 hindsight thing, but as new business models emerge, and I think that's such a big part of your thinking and the work that you do both at Carnegie Mellon and as a venture capitalist, your podcast is Agile Giants. So much of that stuff is about these new business models. And I was when I first heard about what WeWork was doing, I thought this is pretty extraordinary. As you said, commercial real estate needs a good kick in the ass. They need to move into the 21st century.
100%.
Maybe this company could do it. But that aside, and here's the peripheral point in some ways, thinking a lot about what's going on these days with machine learning and various parts of artificial intelligence. I mean, they're extraordinary technologies, and they can drive great benefit for companies, but those companies will be able to realize that benefit only if they are massively transparent to consumers or customers. But
Correct.
Here's how we're using it. Here's what it means. Here's how it affects you or doesn't affect you. Here's your right to say yes or no. And in some ways, I guess the folks at WeWork were blinded by something that caused them to think that they could somehow be immune to this surge of transparency that's taking place now. Big company, little company, whatever industry you're in, it just seems that that's something we're all going to have to answer to in this digital age. And so that's one of the things that puzzles me, because the people at SoftBank, they're not dummies.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the way, people got caught up in the froth and, you know, the hype of stuff. And we're forgetting, I think a point that you always make is, you know, ultimately stuff comes down to, can you make money at this? Sure, it's a cool idea. It's cleverly packaged. Can you make money at it? So I wonder, you know, there's a lesson in there for all of us, I think.
Yeah. So I think you're right. And I think the reality is WeWork is a great idea. It just might be like a $10 billion great idea or a $15 billion great idea, not a $50 billion great idea. And it might need to go out and, 24 months at a price like that. And that's going to be painful for SoftBank, right? And the ripple effects of that are going to be serious. But commercial real estate, I mean, it used to be awful, right? I think if you think about entrepreneurship as making the world as it ought to be, right? The world needs solutions like WeWork. They need co-working spaces, and WeWork really did pioneer this model of buy the drink or buy the desk office space that's really important. A ton of our startups are in WeWork spaces today. Now I think because of how they ran the business, and we don't really know this, but I would speculate, I'm not sure they even have profitable unit economics today on their facilities, right? It turns out, beer and kombucha on tap is expensive. And there's a lot of that in WeWork spaces, unfortunately. And so they may have gone too far, and they may not, they may not have done everything exactly right. I think the brand is still strong. I think if the board actually provides the type of guidance that boards desperately need to in 2019, they could end up building a great valuable company. May not be $50 billion of value, but a $50 billion company is pretty rare. And so I mean, there may be a great path forward, and they've now got these co-CEOs, and we'll see what happens with them. But they did solve a real problem. Some of it also comes back to, I actually do think the community is a really interesting impact of that. I don't think it changes your quote unquote EBITDA, but I think the community is interesting. I mean, a guy that Bob, you and I used to spend a ton of time with when he was in Pittsburgh and still catch up with now and then, Richard Florida, the guy who coined the term creative class, right? I mean, there was no good office space for this quote unquote creative class. And the WeWork guys and this model they pioneered, every city you go to today, it feels like there's a WeWork in it, right? And there's a place for that community to gather. And I think that does, I think you can explain that does deserve some premium, probably not a 5x premium, but it does deserve some premium to, CB Richard Ellis or whoever your favorite comparable commercial real estate business is. Now, I'm not sure if the right way to make this world better is WeWork as a brand new company to pioneer that, or some of these existing legacy businesses that know the fundamentals of running real estate so well. I'm not sure which of those is a better approach. My intuition actually is that potentially one of these established businesses that knows the fundamentals of everything it takes to make an office run on time, integrating some of this creative class thinking and making them a little more community driven, that might be a better way to ultimately solve this problem. Sort of neither here nor there right now, because WeWork's raised so much money. The board has an obligation to figure out the best option for those assets at this point. But I think that they were solving a real problem. I just don't know that it was at this scale. And I do think there was some amount of either lack of transparency or lack of checks and balances between management and the board. Without being in the room, it's hard to know which of those it was that I think ultimately set this company on a really unfortunate path, because it was and hopefully still can become a really valuable entity in the world today.
Sean, there's as always, a number of good points you raised, and let me see if I can get you to just pick up on a couple of these. So you said WeWork's still a great idea. It just might not be a $50 billion great idea, but it might be 10 or 12. And hey, there ought to be more 10 or 12 billion dollar great new ideas, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and the other point that you raise about the need for boards to also transform themselves in some ways, right? Either both the committees they form, the subcommittees, the responsibilities, the priorities. In some ways, you can't, and that's just, anyway. You just proven it here with this story. It's not deadly, but it's going to be horrendously painful for a lot of people in this. There are lessons to learn in it. And the third one I wanted to ask you to pick up on, Sean, is is there an agile giant in the commercial real estate business that might be able to say, hey, you know what? Maybe some of the execution wasn't perfect here, but with what I know and what I have and what I could do, if I have the courage to really change, we can help expand this movement.
Yeah. So I'll hit those in reverse order. On the third one, I hope so. Like, I don't know. I've had a couple preliminary conversations with a couple people in the commercial real estate space. They notice the same thing everybody else does, which is the billions of dollars flowing into this new category called prop tech, right? And they're trying to figure out what that means for their businesses. And part of it is, they've got the opposite problem that WeWork had, right? They've conditioned their investors to expect them to run their business a certain way. And they're going to need to rethink about how they do innovation, how they communicate innovation. It's probably going to look like the process that you saw up close and personal when Adobe went from packaged software to subscription software, right? There's a J curve that comes along with that as you educate the market to evolving business models there. But I think there's a real opportunity there, for sure. On the board point, I think that's incredibly important. Bob, you watched the IT industry go from a utility to a strategic objective for every company, right? And think about how boards changed, both what management was actually in the board meetings, and then also what they were looking for when they were bringing outside directors in to support those companies, as IT went from this kind of corner of the office utility to a thing that drove business value, right? All of a sudden, the CTOs are critically involved in individual board meetings, right? They're in the room when those discussions are happening. And then you're looking for directors who understand that. I suspect over the next 5 years, you're going to see the same thing with transformative innovation. I think you're going to see more and more public companies want to put people who really can help support this transformative innovation around the board table as outside advisors. And you're going to see, I don't know what title they'll give them, but some type of chief transformational innovation officer or whatever, but they're going to have people in the room from management representing these kinds of goals. And then on the needing the $50 billion exit versus the $10 to $15 billion exit, I agree. I mean, you don't get to the scale of SoftBank being dumb. I mean, they clearly were very good at telecommunications, and they were incredibly effective at fundraising. But I think the dynamics of managing a $100 billion venture fund really are tough, because it does mean that a $10 billion outcome actually doesn't move the needle for you. And that's, as a guy who runs a 40-some billion dollar fund, where a $10 billion outcome is career defining, I can't imagine even a $1 billion outcome is career defining for us. I can't imagine the hurdle that you have trying to manage a fund where you have 100 billion AUM and, they're about to kick off fundraising for another fund, supposedly, although I think this WeWork story is going to make that difficult in the short term for them.
Yeah, Sean, I want to tie a couple things together here as we close. One is, last time we spoke, I gave you an acronym that I'd come up with, BTM.
That's right.
Mass Trans, and I haven't heard back from you on that. So
we got to get working on that. Yeah, I have not.
Okay.
I've not started commercializing that yet, but I have not forgotten where attribution should lie on that one.
Okay.
So.
Well, just 50-50.
Okay.
And I think today I would, because I've got another, and maybe we'll do this every episode, but you talked about the community driven EBITDA made up metric MUM. I mean, you want to tell companies you want to stay mum on these subjects. So
I like it. I like it. Yes.
There's some coursework there. So again, we can split that. But Sean, I want to.
I mean, we may need to go thirds on that with your brother as well, because I feel like he could actually teach the real metrics. But I like where you're going there for sure.
Okay. Good. And yeah, there's some listeners. We'll see if we can get any of them involved in it as well.
Good.
But Sean, the ebb and flow of things over time. So you're talking about SoftBank managing, $100 billion portfolio.
Yep.
For investments. When I first met SoftBank, it was in early 80s. And I went over there with one of the family members that owned the media company where I worked. And we sat down, people at SoftBank, they wanted to license some of our properties to begin offering those in Japan. So that was fine. But it was also the lunch at which I ate raw seal. And that's the only time I've done that. And I think that I feel that as SoftBank has transformed itself over time to something quite different from what it was, I have chosen to stay consistent, and I continue to have that be my one and only raw seal experience. And I'd just like to get your impression of that.
Yeah, I'm surprised you ate any of it. I feel like that's the move where you just sort of move it around the plate and hope something else comes out afterwards. But obviously it was a good licensing deal if you were willing to consume a little seal. So.
But I didn't know, that's the thing, that the transparency that I've been yammering about wasn't there. I wasn't told. I just saw this great thing in there. So Sean, know what you're doing, know what you're eating, know what you're investing in, know what you're getting into, know what your board should be doing. A lot of good stuff here.
Yeah, you could have saved them like $30 or $40 billion, Bob. That's incredible.
It all ties together, Sean.
Right.
It all ties together. So Sean, any last words before we head out?
No, I think this has been a fun conversation, Bob. I always appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, Sean. Just before you go, tell us what's up with Agile Giants and where can people find out about it?
Yeah, so you can subscribe to Agile Giants on any of your podcasting platforms. It's as Bob said, it's a podcast where we interview corporate innovators and get their expertise. So we just had on an author from Columbia Business School who has a new book called Seeing Around Corners that came out, and then I'll have an interview coming out later this week, or probably by the time this episode comes out, we'll have just come out with Dave Knox, who has had a really interesting career as a change agent inside Procter & Gamble, and then was CMO of a digital agency for about a decade. And then today does a bunch of work in kind of investing and corporate innovation as well. And it's kind of a fun conversation about his career trajectory and some of the things he's seen there as well. So it continues to be a ton of fun to have those conversations.
Great, Sean. It's a fantastic podcast. I'd urge everybody to check out Agile Giants. And Sean, as always, for your monthly discussions here, Ammirati on innovation. Thank you for being here. And thanks to all of you folks for tuning in and watching or listening here at Cloud Wars Live. And we look forward to seeing you next time.